Hello and welcome to Dining with Death, True Crime Tuesday. When you hear the words serial killer, an image instantly flashes in your mind. I'm sure that image looks different to all of us, but if we were to name the elements of that image, I think the words would be things like man, stalker, a bedroom, a basement, maybe a vehicle, the woods or an abandoned area, and a dumping ground. But what if a serial killer wore a white coat and held your hand during difficult moments? What if he took his victims from what should be a very safe place right in front of other people? And what if he didn't even have to worry about what he would do with the bodies of his victims? Because he had carefully constructed a life where he could kill as many people as he wanted without anyone batting an eye. This is the story of Dr. Death. Let's get into it. Some deaths are shocking and upsetting, and others are not. Some deaths are expected. When someone who is elderly dies at home or dies in the hospital, we're sad, but we're not shocked and traumatized because we expected them to die. We also tend to look at the elderly as having lived their lives. They got their time, they had lots of years, many more than others do who die young, and so in our collective mind, the death of an old person is not as tragic as an unexpected death. But that does not mean that whatever time an elderly person has left is someone else's to take. Of course, whatever time they have left belongs to them and only them. I've watched over the years as my own grandparents have aged and then passed on one at a time. They become frail and dependent on their doctors and those around them to help take care of their daily needs. It's an interesting process to watch. They know their time is coming, but that usually doesn't stop them from getting enjoyment out of the things and the people that they love. Time becomes more precious and they get more philosophical as the inevitable end grows closer and closer. They become a lot more vulnerable and their needs increase. They need people they can trust, and they need people they can rely on. Is there anything more despicable or more evil than a predator who preys on a vulnerable, frail, trusting creature? 1963. Harold Frederick Shipman, born in Nottingham, Nottinghamshire, England in 1946, is living an average life for a 1960s teenager. He went by Fred. He is raised in a devoutly Methodist household. And here we go again. I almost feel like a robot repeating myself in a lot of these episodes, but Harold's mother, Vera, was very, very domineering. We talk about this all the time. It is just uncanny how often serial killers have so many very specific things in common, and domineering or abusive mothers is at the top of that list. Vera was so domineering that she actually handpicked the friends that Fred could play with. He wasn't allowed to pick his own friends. He was allowed very little freedom. Fred was actually more intelligent than his siblings, and Vera had big plans for him. She thought he was very special, and she set her sights on making sure others knew that as well. People report that Fred seemed much older than his age. He was very mature, but because of his mother's controlling nature, he was never allowed any kind of social freedom. And teachers note that they remember Fred carefully watching the other kids to kind of see how they acted as though he was learning from their behaviors. He fit in well with the other kids though, because he was so ordinary, despite what his mother thought of him. Yes, he was a little smarter than some of the kids, but he was a pretty average guy. He excelled at long-distance running and rugby. He was smart and well-liked and had a bright future ahead of him. Fred was very close to his mother, even though she was very domineering and controlling, and I'm sure at times abusive. This is kind of similar to Ed Gein. Kind of loved his mother a little too much and despised her at the same time. When Fred was only 17 years old, Vera got very sick, and soon she was diagnosed with an aggressive cancer. The period of her illness was very difficult for Fred. In fact, his friends say that Fred never even mentioned that his mother was sick to them. They had no idea what he was dealing with until one day he very flatly told a friend of his, who asked how his mother had been, that his mother had died.
Most days, Fred would be coming along the road here from his house, and we would meet at the bottom of the road here, and we'd stop here and just say a few words, and then we'd walk on to the school. And it was on one of those mornings, Monday morning, when I met him at the point just there and just asked him what sort of weekend he's had, and he said, oh, my mum had died. His mum had died, and that's quite a shock, really.
Fred never said anything to me other than once on a bus I seem to remember him saying, my mum's not very well. But that could have been that she'd got a cold.
That must have been terrible. What did you do? How did you cope? And he said, well, I put my gear on, went for a run, and he ran in the pouring rain, so he must have been absolutely saturated.
Before Vera Shipman died, home health care, as it's called here in the States, would come to the family home every day, multiple times a day, to care for Mrs. Shipman, who was suffering. She was in incredible pain, and it was necessary for her to have morphine administered every 6 hours or so. Fred witnessed his mother's pain, and he was very troubled by it. He would spend hours sitting with his mother as she languished in agony. He also witnessed that pain subside each time a dose of morphine was administered, and was relieved that she had found some temporary relief until the next injection. Fred always paid very close attention when his mother was injected with medication. He learned to see it as the thing that brought him relief and a break from having to deal with his mother's pain. Vera Britton Shipman died on June 21st, 1963, at just 44 years old. Fred decides he is going to go into medicine and become a doctor. 1970. Fred graduates from Leeds School of Medicine, University of Leeds, and is now Dr. Frederick Shipman. Just a few years into his career as a general practitioner, Fred had married and fathered 2 children. In 1974, Fred is caught forging prescriptions of Demerol for his own personal use. He was fined £600 and was forced to attend a drug rehabilitation clinic in York. He then quickly moved on to general practice at the Donnybrook Medical Center in Hyde in 1977. He works as a busy physician throughout the 80s, and then in 1993 established his own surgery practice at 21 Market Street. He performed basic surgeries and became known as a man who had a really good disposition for dealing with the elderly and the terminally ill. His peers and his subordinates alike speak of him as professional, knowledgeable, and even on the cutting edge of new procedures. There was something they noticed, though. Dr. Shipman did not like delegating duties that would normally be delegated to nurses. If there was an injection to be given, Dr. Shipman wanted to do that himself. And there were other duties that he took on that would normally be delegated to nurses, but mainly they noticed that he always wanted to give injections. Now, Fred Shipman had undergone a massive change from the asocial mommy's boy that he was in school. He was now outgoing, popular, and even had a waiting list of patients who wanted him to be their doctor. Many of his patients believed that he was very special due to his unique bedside manner and his ability to reassure his elderly patients. Fred seemed to really blossom around older people. They looked up to him, they admired him, and Dr. Shipman was special and he was unique, but not in the ways his patients believed he was. March of 1998. Dr. Shipman does not know that someone has been watching him. A peer named Linda Reynolds has been paying very close attention to Fred Shipman after realizing that people seem to die at an alarming rate whenever they become patients of Dr. Shipman. At first, she thinks it may just be the nature of the medicine that he practices, but soon she believes that is not the case, and she decides she cannot stay quiet any longer. Linda went to John Pollard, who was the coroner for the South Manchester District, and she spoke with him about her concerns regarding the number of deaths around Dr. Shipman. Now, Linda was also concerned about the large number of cremation forms for elderly women that John had countersigned. She was concerned about his license and his standing as a doctor as well. John Pollard looks at the numbers and realizes, yes, there might be a problem. And because he has signed off on so many of the cremations, he wants no part of anything that might be criminal activity. He alerts the police. Investigators review the death records of Dr. Shipman's patients and notice a few things. Yes, the death rate is disproportionately high among Dr. Shipman's patients to similar patients of other doctors. They also notice that the deaths seem to come in clusters at certain times of the day. Sometimes they find that the patient's records have been mixed together, and notes belonging to one patient have been used to attribute death to patients that don't even have the same condition. Even with all of this information, the investigators claim there is not enough evidence to bring charges against Fred Shipman, and the case is closed. Later on, authorities would play the blame game as to why this happened in the face of so much information and so many dead patients, 250 plus dead patients, more than any other doctor with a clientele that was similar to that of Dr. Shipman's. 250 additional deaths to similar doctors whose patients are in similar conditions, that sure seems like enough for an investigation to me. June 24th, 1998. Kathleen Grundy, age 81, was found dead in her home. Despite being 81 years old, Kathleen was in great health. She had no known medical issues, she was active, and she had made no complaints about feeling poorly. The last person to see Kathleen Grundy alive was Dr. Harold Fred Shipman. He later signed her death certificate, recording the cause of death as old age. Kathleen Grundy has a daughter named Angela Woodruff. Angela is an attorney. As an attorney, she knew about her mother's legal matters, and that included her last will and testament, so you can imagine her surprise when a lawyer named Brian Burgess came forward to inform her that Kathleen had a new will, one that her daughter Angela didn't know anything about. The will excluded Angela and her children entirely, but left £386,000 to who? Dr. Fred Shipman. Angela Woodruff knew immediately that a crime had been committed, and Dr. Death had just run up against the wrong lady. The attorney with the new will and Angela joined forces, and together they went to the authorities. An investigation began, and Kathleen Grundy's body was exhumed. Upon examination, doctors found diamorphine, which is very chemically similar to heroin. That drug is used only for terminally ill cancer patients. Kathleen Grundy was not a terminally ill cancer patient. She wasn't even sick. He claimed that Kathleen Grundy was a secret drug addict and even showed them notes he had made in her file where he claimed he had discussed her drug addiction and its dangerous effects with her. Well, Kathleen's daughter, Angela, knew this was ridiculous. She saw her mother all the time. She knew her mother wasn't a drug addict. Investigators took Dr. Shipman's computer into evidence. A computer forensics examination revealed that these notes had been written after Kathleen Grundy's death. Police then found an old typewriter in Dr. Shipman's possession that matched the type on the forged new will that he created for Kathleen Grundy. This evidence, combined with previous complaints about Dr. Shipman's high patient death rate, were enough this time. Finally. September 7th, 1998. Dr. Harold Fred Shipman is arrested and taken into custody. As he sits in jail, authorities begin exhuming the bodies of his patients. They chose the 15 patients whose deaths were the most unexpected. They very quickly found a pattern in those deaths. The bodies had lethal doses of diamorphine in them. In most of the cases, Dr. Shipman had retroactively changed their medical records to reflect medical conditions that would explain their deaths. He falsely wrote that they had experienced a sudden illness or a serious decline in health. He then would quickly sign their death certificates, and only when family members were not involved were they buried and not cremated. So in other words, if Harold was left in charge of these people and they didn't have family members that were interjecting, he would always choose to have them cremated rather than buried. Now, of course, he would say that was because cremation was much cheaper than burial, which it is, but that wasn't the reason he was doing it. Investigators also discovered that by 1996, Dr. Harold Shipman had 67 deaths that were not expected and could not be explained by the patient's medical records. By 1998, that number had risen to 119. Okay, true crime family, you know the numbers. You know the numbers for most serial killers. You can see, right? He is well past the numbers of the average serial killer by leaps and bounds. As one investigator said, no one believes the actual number of premature deaths to be only 119.
He'd been to a house, rolled the sleeve up, administered morphine, killed her. That's what happened, isn't it, Doctor?
No.
The levels were such that this woman actually died from the toxicity of morphine, not as you wrongly diagnosed. In plain speaking, you murdered her.
No.
October 5th, 1999. Harold Fred Shipman, who has been dubbed Dr. Death by the press, is put on trial at Preston Crown Court. He was charged with the murders of 15 women by lethal injections of diamorphine. All of these women died between 1995 and 1998. So that's even more tragic because had they caught him the first time, all of those women would have lived longer. During the trial, it came out that many expert witnesses were very confused as to why Fred chose diamorphine to use as a weapon, because that particular drug stays in human tissue and bones for centuries. One theory as to why he used that drug is that he just wasn't expecting to get caught. Another theory is that he used diamorphine because he knew it was traceable and that he did actually want to be caught. Now, the second theory has some credence because apparently the forgery of Kathleen Grundy's will is so blatant and so poorly executed that either Fred believed he was invincible by that point in time or he just didn't care if he got caught. Several experts testified that Fred Shipman had a grandiose element to his personality. He loved being admired and respected, but more than that, he truly believed it was his right to decide who lived and who died. We talk all the time about how dangerous the ego can be, right? With these kinds of people, they truly believe they are more important and their wants and their desires supersede that of anyone else on earth. It's really fascinating to me. And we see that in people who aren't serial killers. There are just people that believe the universe revolves around them. Fred loved having the power to choose who and when he would kill. One expert testified that he truly believed Fred had a secret hatred for the elderly because he saw them as a drain on the medical system. Other experts say they don't agree with that analysis. They believe that Fred Shipman spent his life as a doctor killing his domineering mother over and over and over again to satisfy some deep sadistic need. When you really stop and think about that, when you really stop and think that it is possible that someone spent years in medical school, years building a medical practice, going to work every day, dedicating themselves to a profession where they're supposed to be helping, only to have this true desire to kill his mother over and over and over again. I mean, that's really terrifying. That's the kind of stuff that brings me back to true crime over and over again. That's horrifying and it's fascinating all at the same time. If that's what he was doing, that is just something to be studied. Many people lose their parents when they are teenagers. Many people have to watch their parents get ill and suffer. Many people do not become serial killers. Many people have domineering mothers. Many people do not become serial killers. There was something dark about Dr. Shipman, something very, very dark and very dangerous. Despite all of the evidence against him, Dr. Fred Shipman never admitted anything at all. He denied writing the will. He denied injecting his patients with lethal doses of drugs. He denied any misconduct of any kind. Now, of course, Fred was sentenced to prison with all of that evidence against him. But even his cellmates say he never once even hinted that he had done anything wrong. He always stated he was totally and completely innocent of all charges against him.
Harold always maintained his innocence to me. He never once, as far as I know, to me or any of the other prisoners, admitted to the guilt of actually murdering any of the patients. I remember when they first tried charging him for 218 murders on top of what they already accused him of. That was the first time I'd ever actually seen him react to his trial on what was going on. I remember when he came back from court, he just broke down in tears and was explaining to me what had gone on, and he said they're trying to pin another 218 murders on top of me. I mean, he said, I don't know where it's coming from or where they're getting the evidence from or anything, you know, where they're getting these stories, he used to call them. And that was the first time I'd actually seen a reaction from him. He smashed his cell up, basically. He just went berserk.
Fred's wife, Primrose, actually firmly maintained that her husband was innocent as well. Fred Shipman liked to play the hero, even in prison. Once he was with a cellmate who attempted to take his own life in their cell, and Dr. Shipman saved the man.
I was in fear for my own life. So much, I attempted to take my own life myself because I was that much scared, like, you know what I mean? He cut me down and resuscitated me, but after that, we seemed to get on pretty well. If he was so intent on murder, if that was his pleasure, why didn't he leave me to die?
Well, I'm not a psychiatrist, but I think I know why. Fred had a God complex. He was the only one who would decide who would live and die. He was the one who decided who got help and who didn't. His thrill may not have been so much the actual murder, but the power to choose whose life he would save and whose life he would end. Harold Frederick Shipman is the only doctor in the history of British medicine found guilty of murdering his patients. Now, there have been other cases and stories, but experts cannot agree on whether or not those British doctors actually committed murder. January 13th, 2004. A prison guard making his rounds approaches Fred's cell. There, he finds the former doctor hanging from a bedsheet tied to prison bars of his cell. Fred Shipman had taken his own life on the eve of his 58th birthday. Once again, he would make the decision who lives and who dies. The many victims' family members immediately expressed their anger upon hearing the news of Fred's death. Not only had he robbed them of their family members, but he had robbed them of knowing he was receiving his punishment in prison. One British paper ran an article calling Dr. Death a cold coward. The Sun ran a celebratory headline that said, "Ship, ship, hooray." The British press is the goat of headline writing, right? It was later revealed that Fred had discussed ending his own life with his probation officer to assure that his wife would have financial support for the rest of her life, because if Fred lived past 60, Primrose would not be entitled to a full NHS pension. On top of that, there is some evidence that Primrose's support of her husband had begun to waver. People close to her said she was starting to suspect he was guilty. What was her first clue? Fred's body was released to his family, but it stayed in a Sheffield morgue for more than a year because police told Primrose that if they buried Fred, his grave would undoubtedly be vandalized. Dr. Death was eventually cremated on March 19, 2005 in the dead of night after the crematorium had closed to maintain the secrecy. The cremation was only attended by Primrose and the couple's 4 children. I certainly hope they're healing and doing okay after this. Must be a great burden to carry, knowing your father was one of the most prolific serial killers in history. An inquiry led by senior West Yorkshire Police Detective Chris Gregg concluded that Harold Fred Shipman had killed at least 218 of his patients between 1975 and 1998. That inquiry was then taken over by Dame Janet Smith, an area judge. She created 6 reports on the matter in which she details the fact that Dr. Death also stole from his patients. Their jewelry was found in his garage. In Smith's final report, issued on January 24, 2005, Smith reported that a total of 459 people died in the care of Dr. Shipman between 1971 and 1998. 459. Now, it cannot be determined how many of those people were murdered, but after years of investigation, Dame Smith said that she was confident the number was no less than 250. 250 victims makes Harold Fred Shipman, Dr. Death, one of the worst serial killers in all of history. Thank you for joining me today on Dining with Death, True Crime Tuesday. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe. I hope you're well. I want you to stay safe and be kind to each other, and I'll see you next time on Dining with Death. Bye.